Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Power Law Investor. Today is October 28th, 2024, a Monday. Again, this is not financial advice, it's only for informational purposes only. And we'll be discussing today, it's the 11th edition of our weekly DCA into Power Law assets. And we'll see how our weekly DCA is proceeding, and we'll talk about what's been going on with some of the actions, the dramatic price action that we've been seeing both in kaspa and Bitcoin. So as a reminder, the power law is the trend line of price data relative to time in the log space. Now here we have it for kaspa, but we also have something similar for Bitcoin, which most people are familiar with. The blue line is the price, and this is in log space. We're taking the log of the x-axis, which is time since Genesis, and log of the y-axis, which is the price in dollars, and then plotting the price in this graph. And we can see that it has a relatively straight trend line with a high degree of fit of 0.9560. And this is the resulting equation. When we take this equation and we convert it into the linear plane, we have that same equation over here. This changes those lines in this previous graph into curves in this linear plot. And if we then make the assumption that the future is going to be like the past, then we can extrapolate to what sort of results and price action we can expect in the future. So currently for Bitcoin, the price on trend, that is if we were on this red line exactly, is about $79,000. And based on that, we have an expected return of about 65% in a year's time if we were to continue and hit this line exactly. Typically, we'll bounce above and below this line, so we won't get that exact number. But if the future is like the past, we should end up, and things remain on trend, this is the kind of return that we can expect. And today, on the October 28th, the price of Bitcoin is just a little below 70K, and kaspa is just trading below 12 cents, right? And the way that this channel is set up is that I've developed an algorithm that looks at the kaspa expected return and the Bitcoin expected return and makes an allocation on that based on how much the expected return is and also how reliable the trend is. So for Bitcoin, we have a much longer time period. So in Bitcoin, we have about 5,200 days. With kaspa, we only have 881 days, so we don't know quite as much. We can't trust the data quite as much. But we can also see with kaspa that we have a much higher expected return. Right now with kaspa, that is above 658%, whereas with Bitcoin, our expected return is about 65%. So the algorithm takes that into account and then produces an allocation for us. And every day we're putting in $100 into this target allocation, which is in this spreadsheet over here. So now what this triangle is saying over here is that 64% of the $100, so $64 are allocated to kaspa, $15 allocated to Bitcoin, and 20% to cash. And following this, we've obtained these sorts of results so far. We started on the 19th of August with $10,000 in our initial bank, investing $100 a day. And currently, we've got about $3,000 left. We've purchased about 0.025 of a Bitcoin. And for kaspa, we have about 36,000 kaspa. And because we've been buying more with DCA, when the price is low, we end up buying more. When the price is high, we end up buying less. Our average price for Bitcoin is about $61,000 over here. And the average price for kaspa, which is about 13.5 cents. All right. And currently, we've invested a total of 7,000, but we're about 10% below that if we were to liquidate today. So that gives you an idea of how this channel works. What I did want to highlight over here is that we've also got a number of limit orders here. So we have about 20% of the allocation in cash, and that is left for opportunities that may come about when the price dips. So to that, we ended up buying at 14 cents, at 13 cents, at 12 cents, and surprisingly at 11.5 cents. I didn't expect the price to drop down quite that low, but it did recently. And that was an opportunity to buy, and I increased our holdings. And for whatever cash that is left, if we do get 10.5 cents, I'll deploy all that remaining cash. So that's just to set up the picture. So now coming back to our graphs over here, let's start off with the Bitcoin and get that over with. Bitcoin is showing action that is getting relatively close back to its trend line. There's been a bunch of increase in price recently, and things seem to be heating up. With the election around the corner, this is not exactly very clear, so I'll zoom out. With the election around the corner, that may cause the price of Bitcoin to spike. And typically, Bitcoin follows a 4-year cycle. So every 4 years, it goes way above the trend line. So you can see this is what kind of happened in the last 4-year cycle and the 4-year cycle before that, etc. So this would be about 2016, then 2000, yeah, so you can get about 2021, 22. So you can basically see that every 4 years you kind of have a jump, right? So this is November 21, so we're in this, so it would be sort of November 25 is when we would expect a similar peak, for example, to show up. So I expect over the next few months that we're going to start seeing a bunch of heating up in the Bitcoin market, and we're going to start seeing this price go up. By now, we expect to get returns about 65%, but I suspect that because of the peaks, when we end up going above the trend line significantly, we'd be ending up getting results that could be much more than that. So I still think right now Bitcoin's at a decent price to buy. 65% is a great return, and which is why with our weekly algorithm, we continue to buy some Bitcoin every day. Now, coming to kaspa, now this is when things get interesting because the action that we've been seeing in kaspa has pulled it way below the previous lines. Previously, the minus 50 trend line, that is the minus 50% to the value predicted by the power law, has been sort of the bottom. And you can see outside of right near the beginning, when the market cap was very small, the price has bounced off around the purple line, not even getting to the purple line, sometimes just getting to the orange line. The orange line is the minus 40% and minus 50%. So if you're looking just at historical data, you would think like buying between minus 40 and minus 50% is a pretty good deal. But now, if you look at where we are right now, you see that we've crashed below the purple line, which is the minus 50 line, and we're now at the minus 60 line. Now, one way to look at this would be like, oh, I just keep on adding different trend lines as we get lower and lower and say, oh, here's another trend line that it could potentially bounce off. And that could be a valid criticism, but the reason I've put the minus 60 trend line is that's what we've typically seen with Bitcoin at the bottoms, right? So if we zoom in, let's zoom in over here. This should give us something useful to look at. You can see that it hits the green line over here. Over here, we end up bouncing pretty close off it. We end up bouncing pretty close off it over here. So kaspa and Bitcoins are both proof of work, but they are quite different. The emission schedules are gradual versus, the halvening or halving every 4 years or so, which happens with Bitcoins, whereas kaspa, it's much more continuous. And based on what we'd seen previously, we thought, look, it's not really going to hit the green trend line. It's going to bounce off the purple one probably at best, or maybe off the orange one, which is the minus 40. But we don't exactly know how much lower it's going to go. No one can tell you. But right now, it is way below the 50% zone for kaspa. And we are firmly, we are just bouncing above the minus 60% trend line. Now, I don't have a quantitative way of telling you that this is going to be the bottom. I don't know the future. Nobody over here knows that. But what we can say is that this is the line that Bitcoin seems to have bounced. So I don't know if this is going to be the bottom. I'm just bringing it to your notice and to your awareness that, hey, this is what happened in the past. And you notice that this exponent has now gone to it's gone to 3.94. And when we first started doing this experiments, I think it was about 4.08 or 4.10. So as we're getting values below the trend line, it's pulling this number down, right? So in my assessment, based on the data that we've seen, this seems like a pretty good point to keep on DCing and improving and increasing our allocation to kaspa. But again, there are two caveats that I think are important to point out. The first one, and the more important one, is that we're seeing deviations that we haven't seen before for kaspa, right? So if we take a step back and you look at it in its entirety, it's following this power law and it looks very nice based on this graph. But you are seeing this big deviation, and the only time you saw a deviation like this was very early in kaspa's history when the market cap was much lower. So is the power law broken? Again, my assessment, like we talked about last time, is that it's not broken, but it's definitely getting bent to the downside. So how much lower is it going to get? What sort of issues are causing this dip? I suspect it has something to do with the KRC20 and the number of meme coins that are launching on the Kaspa network. I don't quite fully understand the details and I don't have a working model of it in my head, but I suspect people are jumping into memes because they provide faster profits. And because of that, they're using up their Kaspa, and that's creating selling pressure for Kaspa. Now, at some point, this will stabilize because the production of Kaspa requires more and more energy or more and more computational power as time goes on. And it's only a guess. I don't know this for sure, but I would guess over time that we are going to stabilize and come back to the power law. But again, I don't know that quantitatively. This is a relatively new phenomena that is taking place, and I don't know what sort of selling pressure we might experience. So that's one thing to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is that with Bitcoin, we are now trading pretty close to the trend line, but anything could happen. I'm not convinced that Bitcoin is necessarily going to start going straight up at this point. It could, that could be a scenario. But another scenario could happen is that Bitcoin takes a surprising drop. And if that happens, if Bitcoin goes down, Bitcoin ends up going into the low 60s or mid 50s, that's also going to pull down the rest of the altcoin market with it. And if that happens, all bets are off. We don't know what sort of price action we could achieve. So for that case, to deal with that, we continue DCAing a daily amount of $100. So you have exposure to buying more Kaspa if the price doesn't go down, and we still have these limit orders placed. So we're saving 20% of the cash for those limit orders. Now, one thing I will say for those of us who are looking to have this sort of dynamic DCA buying more and the price going down, it is basically when you buy a big chunk when the price is going down that you end up pulling the average price down. So for this case, the price of Kaspa on row 70 was this is from the day before, so it's about 13 cents. But once you start getting into the 11 cents, that's when you really started seeing a drop in the average price paid from 14.3 cents all the way to 13.5 cents. So if you are going to play this game, it does require a lot of patience, but then you have to be able to have the guts to be able to deploy your capital when you see the price go down. That is how you're going to pull your average price down. So yeah, I did want to point that out. And the other thing, looking again at Kaspa versus Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin has been on a tear, so we're seeing a big drop in the ratio of Kaspa and Bitcoin. Kaspa is lagging, so we don't know how much longer this could potentially continue. And if you look at Kaspa in the overall altcoin market, you can see that we're on this downtrend over here, and we had this big drop. And I think the big drop in Kaspa from about 12 cents, let's just click on this graph here so we can take a look. If we seem to be getting relatively stable around 13 cents, 13.5 cents, and then we had this big drop. And I suspect this is because of geopolitical tensions, and some of Kaspa's founders are from the Middle East, and given all the tension that we've been having there was a knee-jerk reaction. So I personally didn't expect it to drop down that low, and so although I did have the limit order placed at 11.5 cents, it was a good opportunity, and I'm glad that we were able to deploy some of the funds. But again, the big question that we really want to ask ourselves is, when you look at this graph over here, do you think that the power law over here has started to break, right? And we know that the R squared is still really great at 0.95, but that's looking at the overall market over here for overall time series. It's definitely bending. We're seeing that. Now the question is, does it bounce back or not? Everyone has to think about whether they believe that something has significantly changed in the Kaspa network. And for me, I think it's a question of the KRC20 tokens. People are selling Kaspa in order to participate for quicker profits. So that's resulted in some selling pressure. And then the geopolitical tensions in the Middle East that has pulled the price down for the last few days. Given that, my expectation is that I think we will bounce back there. But there is a non-zero probability that we end up continuing to go lower, right? I don't think we could end up going to zero, but again, this is highly speculative, which is why you can expect returns of about 6.5 times on trend if it continues. So everyone has to do their own balance between risk and reward and figure out, like, hey, do I trust this price action here? Is this a good buying opportunity? The way that I look at it, and it's one way to look at it, is saying, look, I'm expecting a 6.5 times return and I have this sort of data, right? If this sort of data is right, if it continues on to trend, that's 6.5 times. Even if I have a 20% chance of this coming true, I'm going to double my money. So if I believe the power law is 20% right, 80, so 80 times out of 100, the power law doesn't work, but it's right only 20% of the time. If I weigh that across all the possibilities, I still end up doubling my money, right? To me, that's pretty compelling numbers. But everyone has to do their own analysis. And what I mean here is that, what if could we be wrong? Could the power law be broken and could it crash? Yeah. So assume that if you take the expected value of 6.5 times and multiply that by 0.8 times 0, that is, it goes to 0 80% of the time, and then you add the 20% of the time that it does go back to the power law, that expected value ends up being about a return of about 2x, right? So figure out for you, do I think that there's a 20% chance this could be right? And that's a good enough return for me? Or do you want better odds? Or you think it's great or not? Everyone has to make their own assessment themselves. But I encourage you to think about that and think about the world in terms of probabilities. This is all statistics. Who knows what could actually happen? We don't. But we can take an educated guess. And that's what we're doing here. So we will continue on my side to be able to deploy this capital at a rate of $100 a day. And we'll see how the experiment ends up turning out. So thanks so much for listening. Please like and subscribe and put your questions down in the comments below and I'll try and get back to them. Thanks and see you soon.